and welcome to another episode of the Thai Initiative's Thai Luntan. This is our video blog series which explores the ideas impacting the American and Chinese relationship. Today's panel will focus on China's relationship with the environment and how Western nations like the US and the UK have contributed to the environmental pollution problems that plague China today. As a backdrop to our 5 women panel discussion, we will examine Jonathan Watts's When a Billion Chinese Jump, How China Will Save Mankind or Destroy It. And I would like to just take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Heather Pierce, the Director of Operations for the Thai Initiative. Normally, Carson Tavener is our TLT host, but he has stepped aside for this session so that we could discuss a book, as I've already mentioned, When a Billion Chinese Jump. Thai Initiative interns have joined me over the last month reading and discussing this book, and this TLT session is the culmination of the 4 sections, and we will really dive into the institutional and cultural frameworks that plague the CCP's attempts at climate change mitigation. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our panel. I'm going to start with our hometown Seattle intern, Ms. Jessica Collins, and who has also been a great newsletter manager for us, and we're going to miss her in that capacity as she leaves for a trip in Nepal before heading back to school as an undergraduate and member of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. In addition to her busy school schedule, she is also a development intern with the Global Partnerships and is preparing for a month-long trip to Nepal. In 2015, Jessica spent a semester abroad in Kunming, China, where she focused her studies on Chinese language and conducted a month-long independent research study evaluating the accessibility of treatment for HIV and other infectious diseases in China. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Heather. I'm excited to be here with everyone as well. So looking forward to it.
We're really excited to have you on today. So I'm going to move over to sunny Denver, where our other awesome intern, Erin Slauson, is situated at the moment. She is an honors scholar with the Joseph Corvell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and she also has a particular interest in China, and she will be studying abroad this fall at the prestigious Beijing University. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome to have you here today. And Grace Guo is also joining us from the East Coast today, so thank you in the evening time, spending your evening with us. Grace is currently living in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University and is a current Thai Initiative Board Advisor, working closely with Carson Tavener, our Executive Director, on our annual mayor's delegation, and she also plays an integral role in maintaining our relationship with the China Partnership of Greater Philadelphia. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you, Heather. It's quite a pleasure and honor to join this panel.
Well, we're really excited to have you, and so before we get started, I just wanted to set up our conversation a bit for our audience, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the author and the book, Jonathan Watts is a British journalist who has worked as a correspondent in multiple Asian countries, namely China and Japan, for the last 15 years. And around 2007, he set off on a journey to study the environment of China and went across the entire country and recorded his observations in a book that he provocatively titled When a Billion Chinese Jump. He really wanted to capture the complexity of the structures that shape Chinese and their relationship with nature, and the environmental issues that impact the country regionally. I think his structure of setting it up in 4 sections provided a regional context which highlights distinct histories and environmental issues that impact the Southwest, the Southeast, the Northwest, and the Northeast corners of China. Of course, there's always overlap, but it was helpful it was a helpful way to frame the gravity of China's environmental predicament and the sheer size and scope of the historical, institutional, and cultural barriers that are impeding the central government's mandates for environmental reform. Moreover, Watts calls out the hypocrisy of Western industrialized nations and the critical role they have played in China's environmental problems. For example, the shipping of garbage and toxic waste to China, setting up dirty factories in China, and not really changing behavior, just sending it further away from home. So Watts's observations are really compelling, and he did it for people outside of China to understand the precarious state that China's environment is in now and how it really is a global issue. But we wanted to explore a Chinese impression of a foreigner's interpretation of Chinese environmentalism. And so Grace, being a Chinese national, has been very graceful and gracious in participating in our conversation and contributing some really illuminating and valuable perspectives about the book and his perspective, Watts's perspective. I think his perspective is thoughtful and clearly attempts to address a multidimensional view, but it's still Western and it's still a male lens. So I wanted to flip the script a bit, and I have these great participants, and we've spent this last month exploring Watts's book from a Chinese American and a female perspective. So I'd like to get started. I'm just going to briefly lay out that, our session will be broken down into 3 segments. We will start out talking about main takeaways of the central themes and theses of the book. And then we'll move into personal experience of environmentalism, because I think it's really important to capture the stakeholder value that we all have, because this is a collective action problem. This isn't one nation's problem. So I'm really looking forward to your perspectives, ladies, and don't be shy. We're all experts in this because, like I said, it's a collective action problem. And then finally, I'd really challenge us all to explore potential solutions to this seemingly overwhelming problem, since we all concluded that Watts's conclusion was a little grim. So Grace, can we start with you?
My pleasure.
Well, I'd like to start with you. And I'm going to start with this question that I'd like to pose to all 3 of you. Grace, if you could start, and then Jessica and Aaron to follow. So Grace, what did you find successful about Watts's observations of Chinese environmentalism? And conversely, how did Watts's observations fail to capture the systemic, institutional, and/or cultural conditions that influence the state of Chinese environmentalism as a whole and/or regionally?
Thanks, Heather. So my first impression about Watts' observation is he's a deep thinker, and he is very observant, and he's been plenty of times in China and do the research, and it was quite impressive. And he mentioned several factors, including economic development, the economic driver, and culturally, the cultural factor, and instrumental and systematic factor as well. So, for example, he mentioned that culturally, China, like in the Western countries, China does not emphasize on the importance of nature at the same level as it is in the Western country. China culturally emphasize more on consumption and people's benefit. There is less emphasis on wildlife protection or nature protection, and which is true. And for example, he mentioned a very famous book written by a doctor 1,000 years ago, Dr. Li Shizhen, who wrote a book about the Chinese medicine. So actually, that book has the influence on Chinese people, how to look at collecting the important parts from animals like tigers. So it did have some influence on Chinese people's mindset. Uh, well, to get the important part from the animals to generate economic benefit and to make Chinese traditional medicine is important. So there is an economic driver behind that, and some people wanted to have the trade with some zoos in China, and to get from the black market, just to get the wildlife, the animals for economic benefit. So that is the cultural influence, and he is pretty deep and precise that he pointed out. And this is something potentially maybe shocking to even surprising, at least surprising to Western people. And this is he mentioned. So this is from cultural perspective, and he mentioned from economic development, and the local government wanted to drive to have higher GDP, and they sacrificed the environment to have better economic growth rate. Factories are maintained, although they have low production and causing economic or environmental damage. But the local government want to keep those factories working because they want to see their people, the factories are supporting local employment. So he did mention that, and which is pretty good for my side. And what he didn't mention is, maybe because he's a journalist, he's not an economist, and he's not a scientist either. So his style is more how should I put it? It's more it's less it's less from a scientific perspective, or I would say less from a objective perspective to see the whole picture. It's more like storytelling. So one story after another is less. There is less harmonia systematically. So if that is how I look at it. His way. I think this is good is more attractive for people, for maybe Westerners who have never been to China, and to understand what's really going on there and want to hear the real stories. But from an analytical perspective, he might not be precise enough or scientific enough. Yeah, that's my observation.
Well, Grace, I think that is some very good perspective. I agree with you. I think that when I think of his writing style, I mainly look at it as journalism, and he is creating a story from his experiences, and it may be that he is taking the most startling examples and statistics and experiences that he had and documented them, which may in some way have either skewed it in the perspective that it is true and it is as dire and as consequential as he's making it seem, or it may be dramatized in some way. I mean, I personally think about like how unintentional China's environmental I guess, environmental problems are. It wasn't with intention that, you know, he mentioned the baiju, the dolphin that was in the Yangtze River that went extinct a few years ago. Like that it wasn't intentional in any way, nor is any of the environmental consequences that we have. But it just takes uh, longer for us to realize the problem because it is unintentional to begin with, us being the world in general, US and China both. But another thing that I wanted to discuss was just how, oh my gosh, what was I just going to mention? Oh, well, I mean, okay, so I spent some time, as Heather mentioned, in Kunming, China, and I was able to travel to Yunnan and up north to Shangri-La. And it's very apparent that the Chinese people are very connected to their earth and the place that they live in. I mean, I met people who are subsistence farmers who are living off the land and who are understanding that there are different climatic changes that are happening that are affecting their livelihood. And then you go into the south in Sichuan-Banna, where there are farmers who are experiencing leather plantations that are like infiltrating the area, and I think that it's coming to the rise of people's understanding, and I think that also is in part because of for two reasons. One being the just apparentness of the problem, like it's everywhere and it's affecting people directly now, unlike it may have during the revolution of the economy. And another reason is simply because China is growing, and there's a theory called the economic Kuznets curve that I learned in one of my classes, and it's a theory that as economic development increases, the environmental pollution will also increase, and there's a steady increase until there's a certain point where it starts to plateau, and at that plateauing point is when the country has developed so far enough that it has developed the technology, the information, and the opportunities to I guess to realize the problem and fix the problem. And so from there it starts to go downward, and the environmental degradation decreases as development increases. So I think China right now is going through this transition where it's realizing that that there is the problem, and it's gaining the I guess the leadership and the technologies that will help reverse it. But it definitely will take time. It's something that the U.S. experienced as well, I think, in the 70s. So, in a long spiel, those are my thoughts on the book so far, and environment, the issue of the environment in general in China.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I appreciate your feedback. And Erin, just before we go over to you, I just wanted to make the point that as China becomes more efficient, as you were saying, that technology becomes better and they have better efficiencies in place, that they will become more sustainable. I think the big question that we all have is, will it be in enough time? And with the amount of people that are in China, does that even apply to China? I think Grace made a really interesting point in our last conversation about how unpredictable China is at this point when it comes to all of these theories, because it's rogue in ways that it's unprecedented. I just like to keep that in mind as we continue our discussion. Thank you, Erin. Please share your thoughts.
Well, I think that was a really great point that Jessica made when she pointed out that the environmental crisis of China is unique really only in scale, but it's happened before to many countries that are now developed with healthy environments. But in terms of Watts's writing, I think what was very successful about his writing, especially because it's for a Western audience, was that it was kind of in this anecdotal style. So it kind of put stories and faces to these numbers that we see in the West in the news all the time. a lot of times China can seem like this huge faceless country, but I think he was successful in the way that he humanized the people. Secondly, I think I really liked the way that it was broken up into different regional sections, because I also think in the West, the breaking news stories that we see are air pollution. And a lot of people think that it's just carbon emissions, and that's the only problem facing, the only environmental problem facing China. But when Watts starts talking about the different regions, he mentions air pollution, he mentions endangered species, he mentions water shortage and deforestation, and I think these are things that are huge problems for China, but they don't really get the airtime in the news. But in terms of what's unsuccessful, I think I was disappointed that he went into such detail about these different regions and these different environmental problems that China is facing. But he didn't really tie it together in the end. He didn't really set a precedent for action for anything to happen after the book. I think at the end of reading a book that's mostly negative and it's mostly about problems, you kind of have this feeling, okay, well, what's next? What can we do about this? And he doesn't really write about what will happen for the world if nothing is done about it. So that's one thing that I thought was missing, was to take all these different problems in different regions and tie it together in a way that someone can understand, I guess, the scale of the problem for the whole world. So.
Great points, all of you. I really appreciate your perspectives, and I think that we'll probably end up bringing some of this back when we talk about what solutions we think might be helpful, because maybe we're a little bit more hopeful than Watts is. Anyway, moving on to our second segment topic, we'll go back to Grace. And we'll start with, how does Watts's observations confirm or challenge your understanding and experience of Chinese environmental, the Chinese relationship with the environment?
Thank you, Heather. First of all, I would say I was not too surprised when I read his book. Although I haven't been to all of the provinces in China yet, but still I visited many places and read many news when I was still in China. So what he said was pretty, in general, it was not surprising to me. But there's the thing. He wrote this book a few years ago. And China has changed a lot in the past several years on environmental protection. I remember that, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in Beijing, there was a huge air pollution. That was probably the worst time ever in Beijing, that people just suffered. And when I was there, I even couldn't breathe. I was scared. And I believe that was the turning point of people in China starting to be aware of how bad the pollution is, and especially air pollution. There has to be something to be done with this. And after that, I could tell, and there was progressively more and more regulations on protecting environment. And the banks, they get, and I used to work for a Citibank, and I knew that progressively the banks got regulation, a notification from regulators on watching companies that are not operating on a level that can protect, companies that are operating on a level of damaging the environment. So there are progressively some changes from a few years ago, and I doubt that was the time that that probably was the time after Watt wrote this book. So something that happened in the past in China, but it does not represent what's really going on in China right now. So that's from my personal experience, and I think that also Watt, because his perspective as a Westerner, he look at China differently. There are some emotional empathy, a sympathy for the Chinese and the environment in general, but he may not really get into the point how to help the Chinese society or Chinese people to have hope and to have a more bright future. So when I read this book, I felt it was too heavy for me. And there were times I even wanted to put it aside and to embrace more fresh air because it was too heavy. And the reality is brighter than that. And actually, personally, I'm looking for, well, that is I have to admit that Watts wrote a great book. Still, at the same time, I will be looking forward to reading another book that gives people hope and to see there are really some substantial solutions to solve this problem. And China now is working on this direction. And this is something I can share with everyone later.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. I really appreciate that. And again, I'd like to just quickly point out something that you brought up in another discussion that we had that I thought was really poignant, and that is, you know, we might all, and maybe it was Aaron and you both, but we might all have an understanding of what the problem is, but we have unique perspectives from unique national experiences that brings nuances to the solutions that we wouldn't know if we weren't conversing with each other. So I just wanted to make that point because I think that's kind of, it's certainly tangentially related to what I think you were just making the point about the absence of that understanding and being in his narrative. So anyway, thank you. And Jessica, please.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you, Grace, totally. You made me think about scale and how scale plays a role in people's perspective, especially Watts's perspective. I think when we think about, we see these statistics that, in the billions, there's 1.4 billion people in China. I just read an article how 60 billion chopsticks are produced a year in China. It's these massive scales that are so shocking to us that we kind of we become like desensitized to our own our own issues and problems. And so I think it's really worth, it's Jonathan Watts provided everyone with their own wake-up call in a way, not just Chinese citizens or not just the country itself, but also for U.S. citizens in looking at how we play a role in polluting our own environment and our own environmental issues. And it's definitely worth noting that United States citizens produce more or emit more CO2 per capita than Chinese citizens do. Yet we do focus on China being the #1 emitter just because of the scale of things. So I think that's something to consider when reading this book and when discussing environmental problems in general.
My thoughts also had to do with scale. What I was thinking was in terms of how this book confirmed my thoughts about Chinese environmentalism. I think we're all aware that there's this struggle not only in China between preserving the natural environment and the resources and economic growth. And I think when we think about this struggle, normally we think it's the growth of a national economy versus the versus protecting the natural environment. But I think one thing that this book did, which was unique, it also has to do with something I previously mentioned about humanizing the people, is that it's not just about consuming more and growing an economy so that the national economy, for growth's sake, can be bigger. I think this book really focuses about how this actually impacts the lives of individual people. I think there was a story in one of the sections about a Tibetan woman who used to pray for happiness and different things, and now she just prays for more money. But it's not because of greed. It's because China is such it's hard to compare China to developed countries, because China is a country with extremely wealthy people and also a country with a very large population of extremely impoverished people. And I think when we usually think about the struggle between environmental protection and economic growth, we think of a national economy, and it's harder to understand why policies would take the side of economic growth. But what Watts does in this book is that he talks about how that economic growth actually translates into lifting millions out of poverty, and having a China where its citizens have full bellies. It's kind of makes me think of that saying, "Don't tell a starving man about the benefits of a low-calorie diet." I think this book really connects the economic growth of a national economy and the positive impacts that it does and has had on Chinese citizens.
I'm just checking my mic. Okay. Thank you all. Those are really, really good points. And I'd also like to kind of build on that, especially when you're thinking about this dichotomy of poverty and wealth in China. And, you know, it is a unique system in that way, and the scale is unique. And I think Watts also does a really good job of, you know, it being one of his main theses is, you know, you cannot, you know, and one of China's arguments to the rest of the industrialized world, like, it's not fair for you to ask us to curb consumption as we are developing when, you know, when you have polluted the earth and just transferred your waste as you industrialized. And I think that's something that's really important that Westerners need to think about as they work on solutions with China. I also think it's really important, and something I think Watts did well in an anecdotal way, but I think having studied China at a systems level, I don't think he did a great job of explaining how the opaqueness and lack of transparency in the system as it currently exists is a big part of the problems at the local level. And you know, there's examples about the eco-cities that have not succeeded because, you know, they've had all these great technologies that they've included and incorporated. However, you know, at a scale that's so big that it's difficult to actually succeed. Not only that, you know, you have foreign governments coming in a benefactor type way to share successes, like, for example, Germany sharing ways that renewable energy has been successful, but it, you know, even though there's a ton of infrastructure for renewable energy in China, it isn't being used at the scale that it's actually developed. And part of that is because, you know, they're not bringing the civil society aspect to the table that's almost necessary. And so I kind of wanted to reflect that back to you guys before we hit the last segment. You know, could you speak to your understanding of that? And, you know, if, you know, our minds are aligned that way, and Grace, do you feel that there is a need for an independent judiciary, or do you think China is, has the potential to flesh out something that is uniquely successful in China that Westerners have a hubris about delivering the ways that they have succeeded, and are missing keynotes that would actually help it to succeed in China?
Just want to make sure that I get your question correctly. So you're
Okay.
trying to so you're basically asking if there is any successful example in China that Westerners have not heard about that could learn from China. Is that what
No,
you?
not so much, because I think that there's just been so many examples of failed attempts at things that, I mean, it's an understood factor that there are great policies that the central government has put in place, and yet they continually fail in the implementation phase. So I'm curious, if, unless you know of a large-scale project that has actually worked on, in a sense that the implementation is there, and it's just it's not been kind of, the media has overlooked it. But in general, I mean, that seems to be the consensus in academia and in policy circles about the Chinese system and environmental reform. And so I guess I'm asking you if in your opinion, there needs to be some level of civil society or democratic structures in place, like an independent judiciary, for China to succeed, or can you point to something at a structural level that people, yes, are overlooking, that points to the potential for great success on the implementation of environmental reform in China?
Well, that is a big question. I hope I can give you. Well, I hope that I can give more, give you better answers to that. But so what I've learned in the past when I was in China, China is so huge, and the government. The central government wants to implement, has great strategy and plans, and want to implement on province or local level. But on application, during the application process, sometimes the local government have their own plan, and which brings the application makes the application kind of challenging. And I think that currently the Chinese government is working on that, and especially there is the anti corruption campaign. The effects has been improving. This is what I've learned and heard so far, but I'm sorry that I cannot give you a better answer. I wish I could.
Oh, well, I wanted to point to something you brought up, and I was hoping you'd bring it up in your answer, is, you've been involved with clean technology in different forums in the United States, and I believe you mentioned that there's actually a lot of promise and encouragement on the part of implementation in terms of clean technology. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the past several years, China has been doing a lot, especially since the air pollution issue has been brought up, and there is huge social pressure forcing the central government to make some change. So the environment issue becomes so obvious that they cannot even try to avoid.
Okay.
There are so apparently there are more and more of new technologies, not just transferred, and there's a trend of having more new technologies transferred from the Western countries to China, and at the same time, there are increasingly advanced technologies just started from China. So actually, now even has also become I would not say a center, a place where technology can be transferred to other countries. And I also noticed that recently there is a growing need for financing. It's called green financing. That is to support the development of clean technologies in China. So there are increasing more new technologies in the green industry, but there is not enough funding to support the implementation. So actually, there is a reverse. I would call it's a reverse trend. So China now is opening its door and just even more widely and inviting investors from other countries to support, to help the implementation of the technologies. So this is something I believe this is there are news like that posted a few. I believe it's a few months ago, especially I think it was during the time there was more. There were a few. There was some news I noticed at the time. U.S. China had this strategic economic dialogue in Beijing a month ago, and I was at that time I noticed there were more and more voices talking about green financing, and that China is opening its door and asking for more financial support from overseas countries. So my message might not be precise, but it's a trend that is happening right now.
Okay. Thank you, Grace. Erin, Jessica, do you have any additional comments regarding that question? If you can even remember it. Should we move on to the third and final segment?
One more time? Do you mind repeating the question one more time?
Well, it was off the top of my head. I think really what I was trying to ask is, do you think that there is evidence of the system that's in place that is possible, that a fragmented authoritarian state that China is, and the local level buy-in that's needed? Do you think, based on your studies and your experiences either in China or about China, lead you to believe that it's changing at the local level? And if beyond clean technology, there are policy structures that are going in place that don't require a strong independent judiciary or a better placed civil society in China in terms of environmentalism for it to succeed on its own? Or do you think it will have to be some kind of conflation of democratic ideals, in this unique communist system?
I can speak to that if Erin, you don't mind me going first, but I personally, I just took a class called like global environment, and it was mainly focused on the economics of the environment, and it just made me really understand better like the market-driven incentives and how in when it comes down to it, the only thing that will be able to reverse environmental degradation is what caused environmental degradation in the first place, and that is economic incentive in capitalism, and that is going to be the way I think that is going to drive China to help its environment in some way. As the public grows more well-versed and better understands the problems that China is currently having with its environment, the more likely they will be to be incentivized to change to renewable energy, and so that will drive the industry for renewable energy, which will then create the funding that it needs, because there's right now, if there's not enough demand for these renewable energies, there won't be any investment into it, as you were mentioning, Grace, which is currently lacking. So I think I don't know the solution. I don't know if a government is the solution. I don't know if a certain type of government is the solution, but I definitely do think that it comes from individuals trying their best and understanding the problems and fixing them themselves. And I think that bottom-up structure can create more change than we expect. And I think that that's what is currently happening with China. I think people are growing, in their understanding, and it's definitely reflective in, there's a documentary film that came out called Under the Dome that was from the Chinese perspective, to bring public awareness. So I think it's definitely rising. Just time will tell.
Jessica, you've mentioned that Under the Dome documentary before. I really need to watch that.
Yeah, really a startling movie. If reading Jonathan Watts was startling, then that's definitely very startling as well.
Yeah. Going back to the original question that Heather asked, she asked about, I guess, the structure of the Chinese government and how that impacts this question. I do think, I don't think that more democracy is essential for there to be improvements in environmental diplomacy or environmentalism in China, but I do think that the non-existence of an independent judiciary is something that really does impact this issue. There already are a lot of regulations in place, but they're not followed many times at the local level. And when you don't have an independent judiciary to enforce those regulations and correct those problems, that just kind of enhances that problem that does exist between kind of the disparity in power between the local officials and the national government. That being said, I do think that this is one thing that just struck me, and I think it's kind of unique about China, is that change can happen very quickly. I mean, with the Beijing consensus style of government, policies don't necessarily have to go through every level of government, and they don't have to be debated by the public. There doesn't have to be a public mandate. So what this means is that policies can be written very quickly, but it's just a matter of, sorry if you hear any lightning. As you can see, all my light has disappeared. There's now a thunderstorm outside. But like I was saying, policies can change very quickly within this system. So if the policies were to take a turn towards environmentalism, and there was an independent judiciary, I think there would be a lot of potential for positive change.
Great feedback, and from what I gather from what you just said, Erin, is maybe it would expedite change that might already take place by having an independent judiciary. All great comments. I really appreciate it. We're 10 minutes till, so I'm going to wrap it up with our final segment. And the big last question is, as far as what Watts's thesis argues, that China must change the trajectory of how it is growing its economy from both an energy portfolio and rate of consumption. We know that China's central government has included climate change mitigation strategies in the last 3 iterations of its 5-year plans. And the latest taking effect, I think, at the end of 2016. So, however, do you think it is possible, for China to do this? And I think we've already touched on that in the last question that I asked in your responses. So, I think, in the end, what is China's responsibility and international diplomatic obligation? Does China have to and how do we come together in international cooperation, especially the U.S. and China, especially Americans and Chinese, because we are that interdependent relationship of economic, of an economic system that is polluting more than any other place or relationship of places, if you will, in the world. So I ask if you guys have ideas of any solutions, and I'd also like to close, because we are an all-woman panel, I wanted to just point out that, I recently read an article about how there was a study that talked about board members, board of directors that have women on their boards have better improvement in energy efficiency, measures to reduce carbon emissions, investment in renewable power, strong partnerships with local communities. I mean, this is something that they're finding is taking place when women are in positions of power, and they even mentioned specific corporate executives in China that are women. So I'd like to leave you guys with this question of, how do you think women play a role in China, both foreign and domestic, in shaping a solution or the solutions that would be necessary to successfully combat global climate change? Easy question, Grace, go for it.
So when I think of this question, I would not label myself as a woman because I'm a woman, so I should think of this question this way. I consider myself as a global citizen. So as a global citizen, what is the right perspective on looking at this? So now China and the United States, as you just mentioned, these two big countries should actually take more responsibilities, and it's not something just about China. It's not just something about the United States. It's a global issue. And United States and China now are really working on the climate change issue. And I could tell that since I'm in Washington, D.C., I have the privilege of going to those events at different think tanks from time to time. A month ago, when it was the time approaching the U.S.-China strategic economic dialogue, and I listened to many experts. They all give very high comments on the progress China has made on making the environmental change, and you also mentioned that China has this 5-year plan. So the recent 5-year plan, covering from year 2016 to 2020, so about 50% of the target, the goals set by the central government are about environmental change, and that's quite promising. And most of them have very substantial measures. And this is nothing. This is something very new, and China never showed. So this is a very positive change, and that received very positive feedback from those experts I listened to in Washington, D.C. Although China and the United States have some struggles on other areas, but climate change is definitely a field that the two countries can work together to move forward and to how to say, there to use climate change, the initiatives between the two countries, and initiative on subnational levels, city levels, provinces levels, to break the ice. This is what I see hope. And so personally, I'm now involved in the Philadelphia and Tianjin sister city, how to say, the Tianjin city in China and Philadelphia in the United States have this have a partnership on clean technology initiatives. So I am fortunate to get involved in this process, and I can tell, I can see how the two sides are enthusiastic of moving things forward. And because of this experience, I see how China is really, well, just even compared to a year ago, how China now is being enthusiastic. And me as a Chinese, how I can be part of this initiative, this movement, to help the two sides to build up this relationship and to move things forward. And I see that maybe it's just a tiny part I can play, but I see that if everybody, as a global citizen, have this awareness to move things forward, to have this awareness to make the world a better place, we all can do something to change it.
Thank you so much, Grace. That's a great commentary. Um, and Jessica and Aaron, I'm sorry, it's getting really close to time. So if each of you could give like a 1-minute comment, I would love to hear your what you have to say about this.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely agree 100% with what you're saying, Grace. I think you bring up a lot of good points. I myself am very hopeful. I think that what has been done, and there's a lot that we can't take back as a, I guess, as a country and as a global community as well. But from now on, I think that as long as politicians uphold their promises and commitments to international partnerships and agreements, I think that then that will be the biggest, make the biggest difference, as well as building public understanding and support and education and awareness surrounding all these issues. I think the more we have these discussions, the better. And so I'm really grateful that I was able to be a part of this and to learn from all of you. Definitely appreciate the fact that we discussed this book. I learned a lot from Jonathan Watts as well. So.
I agree with what Grace and Jessica have both said. I think that specifically in the U.S.-China relationship, there's so much potential for impacting environmental diplomacy all over the world. I think the world is really waiting for the U.S. and China to work together on this, being the two largest economies and two very powerful countries. I think that a Sino-American kind of environmental pact or different policies that are uniquely Sino-American. I think that those would be really influential, and I think they could be used as models for agreements between many countries. I think, like I said already, I think the world is waiting for this to happen, and I think really when the U.S. and China partner together to do something, I think the rest of the world really will follow suit. So I also am optimistic. I mean, we have to be optimistic, right? I'm pretty optimistic about the U.S.-China relationship, and again, echoing what Grace said, I think there's a lot of potential at the subnational level for this to happen. So I'm really happy that we're participating in kind of a subnational exchange right now. So thank you so much.
I thank you guys so much, and I think that it's a tribute to the level of thought and intelligence that you guys have put into these discussions and our TLT today, to demonstrate how encouraging it is to see the future of China and America in the three of you, and take that out times 10, right? And we have a real promising future for international cooperation, collaboration, and a real answer to climate change mitigation. It has been such a pleasure to engage in this way with all of you, and I look forward to more conversations with you, and thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for joining us in our Thai Luntan today. And please check us out at thainitiative.org and join our newsletter. We have lots of great things coming down the pike this summer, and really excited about our mayoral delegation in the fall. Grace, Jessica, Erin, thank you so much, and 再见.